Esther. Courage for a Greater Purpose. Book of Esther. The story of Esther is a powerful testament to faith, courage, and God's providence. Though God's name is never mentioned in the book of Esther, his hand is evident throughout, orchestrating events for the deliverance of his people. Esther's journey teaches us vital lessons about stepping out in faith, trusting in divine providence, and using our influence for good. 1. Stepping out in faith, risking it all for her people. Esther 4:16. If I perish, I perish. Esther's story begins with an ordinary Jewish girl who became queen of Persia. Initially, her identity was hidden, and she kept her Jewish heritage a secret. However, everything changed when a wicked man named Haman devised a plan to annihilate the Jewish people. Esther's cousin, Mordecai, urged her to intervene with the king. The risk was enormous. Approaching the king uninvited was punishable by death, yet Esther chose to act. She declared, "If I perish, I perish." This is one of the most courageous moments in the Bible, showing that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. Esther's bravery didn't come from her own strength or desire for fame. It came from her faith in God's greater purpose. She understood that her position as queen wasn't just for personal gain, but for a higher calling, to save her people. Key lesson: stepping out in faith often requires risking something of great value, whether it's our reputation, comfort, or safety. But when we trust in God, He gives us the courage to face the unknown. Like Esther, we may be called to take a step of faith that seems risky, but God will equip us for what He has planned. Application: are there areas in your life where God is calling you to step out in faith, despite the risks? Courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to move forward with trust in God's plan. Ask God for the courage to step into His calling for your life, even when the outcome is uncertain. 2. God's providence, working behind the scenes. Esther 4:14. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? One of the most fascinating aspects of the book of Esther is how God's providence is woven through every detail, even when His name is never mentioned. Esther's rise to become queen, Mordecai's uncovering of a plot against the king, and the ultimate reversal of Haman's evil plans were all orchestrated by God. Each event, no matter how small it seemed, was used by God to fulfill His greater plan. Even though God was hidden in the story, He was actively at work, setting the stage for Esther's courage and action to bring about the deliverance of the Jewish people. From Esther's position in the palace to Mordecai's timely discovery of a plot against the king, everything fell into place in God's perfect timing. Key lesson: even when we can't see God at work, He is still sovereign, controlling the events of our lives. God's providence works behind the scenes to accomplish His purpose, and He places us where we are for a reason. We may not always see the why behind every circumstance, but we can trust that God is working things out for our good and His glory. Application: if you feel like God is distant or silent in your life, remember that His providence is at work behind the scenes. Like Esther, you may not always see the bigger picture, but trust that God is preparing you for His greater purpose. Ask God to give you eyes to see how He is working in your life and to trust His timing, even when things seem unclear. 3. Using your influence for good. Fulfilling a greater purpose. Esther 4:16. Gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. When Esther became queen, she had access to the king and influence over the entire kingdom. However, she could have easily chosen to stay silent, enjoying her royal position without intervening. But Esther recognized that her position wasn't just for personal gain, it was for a greater purpose. Mordecai's words, "Who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" challenged Esther to see beyond her own life and realize that God had placed her in the palace for the deliverance of her people. Esther risked everything to speak up for the Jews, using her influence not for her own benefit, but for the greater good. Key lesson: we are all given influence, whether in our families, communities, workplaces, or on social media. God doesn't give us influence for selfish purposes. He calls us to use it for His glory and the good of others. Esther used her position of power to help those who were vulnerable. We too are called to use whatever influence we have for righteousness, justice, and the greater good. Application. Think about your sphere of influence. Whether you are a student, a professional, or a leader in your community, how can you use your position to make a positive impact? Your influence is a gift from God, and He calls you to use it for His kingdom. Ask God to show you how you can use your influence for good, whether it's standing up for justice, advocating for the vulnerable, or serving those in need. 4. Courage is a choice, acting despite fear. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the willingness to act despite it. Esther could have been paralyzed by fear, knowing that going before the king without being summoned could result in her death. Yet, she chose courage because she understood that the cause was greater than the cost. Just as Esther had to face the unknown, we too are often faced with situations that demand courage. Whether it's standing up for what's right, facing a difficult decision, or trusting God in an uncertain season, courage is required. And like Esther, we can rely on God's strength to do what He has called us to do. 5. Faith and action go hand in hand. Esther didn't just pray for a solution to the Jewish people's plight. She acted. Faith isn't passive. It moves us to action. Prayer and planning go hand in hand. Esther's faith in God led her to fast and pray, but it also led her to take decisive action in a dangerous situation. Faith should propel us to act, trusting that God will provide what we need along the way. We may not see the full picture, but we take the next step, trusting that God will lead us. Final encouragement. God has positioned you for a purpose. Esther's story reminds us that God positions us where we are for a reason. No matter how unlikely or difficult our situation seems, God can use us for a greater purpose if we choose to step out in faith, trust His providence, and use our influence for good. Reflection questions. What challenges are you facing that require you to step out in faith? Can you recall a time when God was working in your life, even when He seemed silent? How can you use your influence to make a difference in the lives of others? What fears might be holding you back from fulfilling your God-given purpose? Are you willing to trust God's timing, even when you don't understand His plan? Conclusion. Esther's courage and obedience to God's call resulted in the salvation of her people. She understood that her life wasn't her own. It was part of a greater plan. The same is true for us. God has positioned you for a purpose. When we step out in faith, trusting His providence and acting with courage, He can use us to accomplish great things for His kingdom. Remember, like Esther, we all have a unique purpose, and God can use anyone, no matter how ordinary they may seem. Just as Esther impacted an entire nation, our actions today can impact the lives of those around us and future generations. Let's choose faith, courage, and obedience, knowing that God's plans will always prevail.